There was a time when I almost became a drummer. And I thought I was Popeye. I uh, I loved Popeye when I was at the cartoon. When I was a kid, he was like a major hero to me. And I'd watch that cartoon, and someone in the family bought me a little white sailor's hat. So I used to run around the house with the sailor's hat on, making a face like I thought was Popeye. And I believe there's a picture somewhere that survived that showed me doing that. I'm not sure where it is, but yeah. And drumming, well, that leads me to one of my next heroes, who was a fiddler from New Brunswick named Don Messer. And he had this drummer named Warren McCrae, who on the B-sides of tunes would go over with the sticks to the chapel block and play these press rolls. And he was just, his timing was so impeccable. And I got to where I was just a little kid, and I would watch the Don Messer show in syndication reruns in the early 70s. And Warren had these drumsticks that, to me, I could be wrong about this, but it seems like to me that they were black with white ends. They almost looked like magic wands. And he'd be hitting that chapel block, and I'd just be losing my mind, He'd play the whole B side of a reel on the chapel block, and the rest of you rolling along on the snare. And I got to the point where I became so obsessed with this before I started took up string instruments. My mother was an avid reader, and my mother was a very well-educated woman. I don't know if she got grade 12 or not. It's hard to say, I can't remember, but she was very well-read, and she was adamant that I learned to read at a very young age, and I did. She would read me, everything from Gulliver's Travels to Treasure Island. She had read the complete works of Dickens to me by the time I was 6. And when I was only 4 or 5 years old, I could read, at a 7th or 8th grade level. And it was just something that was part of the science, that constituted my makeup, was getting all that reading in early in life, and having the comprehension, knowing what most of the things meant. Because I'd ask questions, I'd ask her what things meant, and she would tell me. And so she had bought me all of these golden books, and they were little, 10, 15-page storybooks about Brer Rabbit and the Three Pigs, and they were hard covered in those days. So I would find 2 Bic ballpoint pens and would get one of those hard-covered golden books and sit down in front of the stereo with the Don Messer record and play the drums on the cover of this book with these ballpoint pens and copy Warren McCrae, and to the point where I beat the balls out of the ends of the pen and all the ink would come out on the book. And I destroyed book after book after book like that. And my father took notice of this, I guess, somewhere along the way, and decided one Christmas that he was going to buy me a drum set. And he did. He bought a drum set, a full kit, if I can remember correctly. It wasn't a big elaborate kit or anything. It was like a Sears and Roebuck deal. I mean, we still had, in those days, he was making a great deal of money, but he was pretty frugal. And so he brought this kit home. I remember getting up Christmas morning, and there was this box beside the Christmas tree that appeared overnight mysteriously that was so big I couldn't see the tree anymore because the box was in front of it. And I ripped it open, and sure enough, it was a drum kit. And there was also my mother had gotten a Buck Owens record for Christmas. And I remember my father setting up the snare and setting everything up. And there was a set of brushes with the kit. And me playing the snare. I never figured out that what the kick drum was even for. I didn't know. And I was just a kid. I was like 5. I think it was 5 years old maybe. And so I played the drums I played that kit forever. It seemed like weeks and months went by, and I picked at it. But the guitar was the thing that eventually caught my practice interests, and the drum kit ended up getting. I popped holes in all the heads, and it went away. But there was a point in time, and they were encouraging me too. They thought it was amazing that I had the kind of rhythm I did, I guess, and because my rhythm was excellent to be that young. I had an extreme sense of rhythm, and I ended up utilizing that more for guitar than anything else. Old time music, was a huge part of my upbringing, and there was a time when I've been in different situations, let's say, in my life over the years, that there were places where I didn't really mention that too loudly because, especially in the Cape Breton community, there's a general sort of opinion maybe that old time fiddle music, and I heard this in my own household when I was a kid, because my father used to profess his hatred for Don Messer, but yet he never missed the show. At the time I was a kid, it was in syndication in Hamilton, Ontario at the time, I think, and we were watching it every Friday night. And my father professed hating Don Messer and old time music. He didn't like. He said he didn't like Lee Cremo because Lee didn't play the way other Cape Breton fiddlers played. There was a certain prejudice from Cape Breton fiddlers and Cape Bretoners, even demonstrated even in my father's life, against stuff that wasn't Cape Breton. It was somehow lesser, not as difficult, somehow technically inferior to Cape Breton fiddle music. And but for some reason there were always old-time fiddle records in my house. We had Don Messer albums. We had a Graham Townsend record, which was life-altering for me. And I was exposed, sitting at the turntable listening to these records that weren't Cape Breton fiddle. The exposure to all that different music in my early childhood had a huge impact in shaping what kind of a player I'd become initially as a fiddler. I mean, when I first started playing the fiddle, I did indeed try to emulate Winston Fitzgerald, because that was the music I was most familiar with as on a first-hand basis, because I would watch my father play it from when I was a child. And so I'd seen it done, and close up. And so the presence of old time music gave me another option when I first started playing the violin. But I soon, like I said, it's sad to me that there are these prejudices inside music. Like, there's always somebody saying, well, I don't like that kind of music, or I don't like that artist, or I don't listen to that type of thing, or whatever the case may be. And I've always been confused by that, because to me, all music is the same. There's an intrinsic value in just about any kind of music you care to listen to, or look at, or discuss. There's value in everything, right? But this wouldn't be the first time in my life that music would cause, strife or argument. It's happened a lot. It even happened before I was born. There's a famous story in my family about, to give you another idea of the kind of situation we were all brought up in. when my mother and father moved to Ontario, they lived in a high-rise apartment. You can imagine what that must have been like for them, because these are people that lived in houses, standalone houses, farmhouses out in the woods for their whole lives. They'd never even seen they didn't know what a high-rise apartment even looked like. They get to London, Ontario, and they're surrounded by them, and they end up living in this place on Adelaide Street, I think, in London. And my father no longer had a real outlet for his music. He had nowhere to play. He didn't really know anybody up there. And my mother was a rough case. My dad discovered there was a Newfoundlander living on the floor above us, or them. I wasn't born yet. And Joe and Bob were both at home at this time in their teens. And so my dad discovered this Newfoundlander, and he started going up there on Saturday nights and playing the fiddle and drinking. And he wasn't inviting my mother, for a good reason, because she was a wet blanket. It would have been hard to have a good time with her in the room. So he would go up there and come down drunk at 1 o'clock in the morning. He wasn't hurting anybody. He never bothered anybody. He just went up there. He wanted to play the fiddle, and he wanted to talk to somebody else from the Maritimes. My mother got real upset about this. And the thing that bothered her the most, sadly, was that apparently one of the Newfoundlanders up there in the apartment was a homosexual. And my mother was, unfortunately, a terrible bigot. And she had a variety of prejudices, and that was one of them. So she was mad that one of these guys was gay, and she was mad that Paul was going up there and having a good time without her. And I mean, I think she had been invited up but didn't want to go, because she just didn't like anybody. So, and there was no piano up there. She couldn't be involved, couldn't get any spotlight. So that was it. So anyhow, he comes home one night, and they had an upright piano. He always kept a piano for her in the house. So there was an upright piano in the apartment. And he walked in, never said a word. He came in, he put the fiddle case down on the piano bench, and my mother went over to the case, opened it, took the fiddle out, and smashed it to pieces on the edge of the piano bench. So at that point, my father, who was probably the most nonviolent guy I ever knew, and had been married to this woman for some time and had taken tons and tons of abuse from her, walked over to her and punched her right out cold. One punch, and hit her in the side of the head, and she had a mole on the side of her head, and he hit it and busted it, and it started bleeding. And he was very angry. I never saw the man angry, so I don't really know. My brothers might be able to tell you more about his anger, but I never saw the man angry, so I don't remember anything about my dad this way. But one or both of the boys came out of the bedroom to see what the hell this commotion was. And they come out, and the old lady was on the floor. My dad was standing over her, and he looked at the two boys and said, "Get the hell back in your room, or you're both going to get the same thing." And that was the only time in my life that I ever heard anything about my dad that could be misconstrued, or not misconstrued, but chalked up to being mean or ornery or violent or any of those things. And as soon as it was over, my father just walked away, and he went in the kitchen, and he started to make a sandwich. So my mother at this time also, who was being silent, which was real dangerous. When my mother got quiet is when you started to get scared. because she was dead silent when she went on the before she went on the rampage. It was a good idea to get the hell out of the way. If you couldn't hear her doing anything, it was problems. So my mother got up off the floor, went in the bedroom, got the .22 rifle, put a shell in it. The magazine was lost. She'd had the gun for years. She kept it with her till the day she died, that rifle. It was an old Marlin .22. She put a .22 short shell in the chamber, jacked the bolt over, walked out in the kitchen, and looked at my father and said, "If you ever lay your hands on," and pointed the gun at him, right at his head, and said, "If you ever touch me again, I'm going to kill you." And my father started laughing at her because that's what he was like. He didn't think she was serious. He started laughing, and he reached for the gun. And when he reached for the barrel of the gun and he pulled it towards himself, and the gun went off, and the bullet hit him in the side of the head, ricocheted off his skull, and went into the fridge. So they're both standing in the kitchen bleeding. My mother's bleeding from this mole, and my dad's bleeding from this graze. And they're just standing there looking at each other. And that was the end of it. My mother just turned around and walked away. My father made his sandwich, held the dish rag on his head till the bleeding stopped, ate his sandwich, and I don't believe that they ever spoke of that again. But it's just an example it's a sad example of how much strife there was in the household over little stupid things. My father meant no harm by going up there to play music at that guy's apartment. And he worked himself to death 5 days a week. Provided well for everybody. Like when he first moved there, of course, he had never made money like he made with Ellis Don. It was absolutely unbelievable the amount of money he was making then. You know, it was a ton of money, and for those times. And he never denied anybody anything. But, you know, my mother she just couldn't stand to see other people happy. It's just that simple and sad, but if you looked like you were having a good time, especially without her, if you were with someone else and doing something that brought you joy, she would always attempt to tear it down, destroy it in any way she possibly could. And it went for everybody around her. She did this to everybody in the family. So, like, when I think about all the things that were happening, you know, and it had already happened. Like, there's so many stories about my family, my mother and father's marriage, which lasted 32 years. It's a wonder that any of us even survived it. And no wonder that I decided, you know, even at the age of 3 and 4 years old, that I had to find refuge somewhere else besides in my family unit, and music became the refuge. And so Don Messer was an integral part of what I was listening and listening to and hearing as a child, and it went through right until I was in my teens, and started to play and got my first violin and started to play the fiddle. My dad, it's a wonder my father never took me under his wing and tried to teach me the violin. He did try to teach me. This is so ironic too. He tried to teach me a tune one time in the violin, and instead of, you know, one of the simple old tunes like Ragtime Annie or St. Anne's Reel or whatever the hell, What does he do? He teaches me a waltz in B flat. Dum dee 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 da da dum dee da. In B flat, it's the hardest key in the fiddle, right? And guess who wrote the waltz? Don Messer. It's so funny, right? Like he could have chosen to do anything, teach me anything, but he chose a Don Messer tune. And I remember being able to actually play what he taught me, and I would practice it from time to time, but I was so afraid of touching his violin that I didn't get after it too much. But he did try. He was by then, as I say, I was pretty well completely enthralled by guitar, and the violin just wasn't in my future at that point. Another bit of sadness about that whole episode was that this occurred, the incident with my mother and father and the fiddle and the gun occurred in 1965 or 66, 3 years before I was born. And my father never replaced the fiddle, and I don't think he ever would have, except when I was around 6 years old. Bob and Joe found a violin in a pawn shop in London, and I think they gave $500 for it, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe I'm wrong about that. I'd have to ask them, but maybe that's wrong. It might have been way less. But anyhow, it was a German conservatory violin. It had a stamp on the back of the headstock of the scroll. And my father, they brought this. I remember the day this happened, because I knew my dad played the violin, but I didn't know, how serious it was, how good he was, and how, I remember seeing him play it that first day, and I was a year into playing the guitar, and then, of course, that's when I started, playing with him, at the age of 6 or so, and became exposed to Fitzgerald and all the Cape Breton music and stuff. But it was sad, that my father, I don't think ever would have replaced that fiddle. The boys went and bought it for him, and brought it home, and he played it every chance he could until the day he passed away. But I feel bad that he didn't have a fiddle for the first 5 years of my life. I'm not sure what would have happened, because I was such a sponge in those days. Not sure what would have happened to me musically if I had been exposed to him playing for that first 5 years. I was only basically exposed to guitar players and some fiddle, of course. But I mean, having that in front of me, like I had Joe in front of me with the guitar, if I had Dad in front of me with the fiddle, I may have taken a whole other path. But then again, there's some people say that it doesn't matter what you do, nothing would change. You know what I mean? I'm on either side of that. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's hard to say what would have happened. They say that Chet Atkins got his first guitar by trading a pistol to get his first guitar. So what would have happened if he had had gone into that world and become a soldier or become a police officer or become whatever? I don't know what. If he became proficient with a pistol as he was with a guitar, like all those, all that supposition about, whether you take the left fork or the right fork or you go straight. It's interesting to think about. I don't know if there's any credence to it, but I do regret not having as much time with my dad, with that extension of himself in his hands, that fiddle that was so much a part of him, and he made it a part of him again, in the tail end of his life. And it definitely helped me, steer towards the violin more and more. And yeah, so Don Messer, uh, it was a big deal. It was a big deal for me because it was a guy that I could see on television. It was a record I could hold. It was Warren McCrae playing that crazy chapel block and driving me nuts. It just gave me goosebumps, hearing him play and hearing Cease McCachran and play the guitar and whatnot, and Vic Mullen on the banjo, and it was just the music itself was so happy and well orchestrated. Which was a big part of why I listened to certain kinds of music, because of the orchestration, the way the band sounded. There's something about that just drove me nuts. Like it just egged me on and on and on. And the Islanders, in my opinion, were one of the finest ensembles that ever took shape anywhere in North America. You can put their old albums in any of their albums when they were full band, going full blast, recording on zero technology. You listen to those old records and the level of musicianship that's occurring. Especially like Waldo Monroe's piano playing, and the way that Don delivered tunes, so clean and precise, and he always sounded the same. He always had the same tone, the same delivery. It was so easy to love it, Meanwhile, my dad would say, "Well, that stuff, that ain't real fiddle music. That's stupid barn dance music, right?" Well, it was way more than that to me, and unfortunately, Messer passed away, I think in 1973, if I'm not mistaken. And I never got to meet him. I met his daughter, and I met Waldo Monroe, and I met one of the other ones too. I can't remember which one it was. But anyhow, I may possibly Cease McCachran, I think, over in Prince Edward Island. But yep, he was a huge hero, huge influence, and strangely, it became that style of music became a catalyst in my own career for a lot of things that happened to me, and a lot of personal relationships that occurred because I played old-time fiddle music as well. Initially, that was all I really kind of played in public. When I started playing the violin, nearly 10 years later. Yeah, so Don Messer was a big hero, and he was a big hero to all people in Canada, I think. He was the number one show in Canada. He surpassed the ratings of even Hockey Night in Canada on the CBC. So that's a big thing to remember, and a great hero for, if people don't know him, or these young players, they might not realize or have listened to those old recordings or seen any of the video footage of him. Man, it's really something to see, and something you should look at. I know he changed my life.